Okay, welcome to the second of our lectures in the Ocean Lecture Series here at Radcliffe. So just to, for those of you who are new here, we have a theme for the science portion of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study this year, which is on oceans and various aspects of oceans. Our first lecture in the series was about adapting to hurricane risks. We had a science symposium which was talking about the origins of life in the oceans and also the role that the oceans play in climate and the pressures that we are putting on the ocean. So today we have two speakers from the local Boston sector in District 1 from the Coast Guard to talk about two particular aspects of the Coast Guard's missions. But let me give you some background. I teach a course at Harvard in navigation, which came as a result of a kayak accident that I was in close proximity to. And a book emerged from that. One of the members of the Coast Guard from the Boston sector approached me and asked me to give a talk to the officers about that, and we started to form something of a loose-knit relation and discussion, in part because I'm a sea kayaker. We carry around little VHF transceivers and listen to the Coast Guard and listen to their advice about how to stay alive out there. And recently I was given a tour of their facilities in Boston. About 2 years ago, we had a science symposium on navigation where we had an expert on land-based search and rescues. And I've always been curious about how search and rescues are done in nearshore waters and offshore waters. And so that was one of the themes that I was hoping to explore a bit here. And the other theme has to do with the stresses that we humans are putting on the oceans. We sometimes think of it as an infinite resource, but on the other hand, it's really turning into a very finite resource in terms of the fisheries, the amount of plastics in the ocean, this kind of thing. And the Coast Guard is on the front lines of trying to protect that resource locally. So I wanted to explore both of these items in a talk, which we're going to be splitting. So we have here today Captain Claudia Gelzer, who will be talking about the environmental protection aspect, and Commander Titus, who will be talking about the search and rescue aspect. So without any further ado, Claudia, can you introduce the topic? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Professor Huth. It's really, truly an honor to be here with you tonight, and I'm in awe of everyone coming out. It's very Coast Guard night for you to come out, and thank you for weathering the storm. We feel at home in this weather, but as you heard, I'm Claudia Gelzer. I am the local operational commander for the Coast Guard in Boston and Massachusetts, and I'm here with my colleague Titus. And we're really grateful to the Radcliffe Institute and Professor Huth for including us in this important discussion on the health and protection of our oceans. The Coast Guard has a huge interest and stake in many of the issues that have been explored over the past, or for the next couple months that are going on, and certainly at the Ocean Symposium. And I thought it would be good if I could begin with some broad context, just kind of about the Coast Guard, which I feel is, we're right in your backyard. And yet, I still feel we're a service that's a bit mysterious to some. And so it all began in 1790 as a vision of our founder and one of the nation's founding fathers. He's someone who's finally getting some of the well-deserved recognition in the musical Hamilton, although some say it's overrated. Alexander Hamilton proposed the precursor to the Coast Guard, saying, "A few armed vessels, judiciously stationed at the entrances of our ports, might at a small expense be useful sentinels of the law." And that is how it began, with the revenue cutter service, comprised of just 10 ships keeping watch along the East Coast to enforce tariff laws. From those days, our service has evolved enormously. Created by fusing the revenue cutter service, the life-saving service, the lighthouse service, the Bureau of Navigation, and the Steamboat Inspection Service, to officially form what was called, starting in 1940, the United States Coast Guard. And just like the revenue cutter service to this day, we stand guard in our ports executing a variety of maritime missions that uphold safety, security, and environmental protection at sea, and I would argue still at a relatively small expense. So this is kind of depicting the variety of missions, and really I've kind of divided it into when we are protecting people from the ocean and when we are trying to protect the ocean from people. So again, privileged to be part of this ocean lecture series. Your Coast Guard is hugely invested in activities at sea, but I want to stress that those activities span well beyond the oceans. While we have a considerable presence on the east, west, and Gulf coasts, we also protect the Great Lakes, the mighty inland rivers, and waters in U.S. territories. And for the first time, we're encountering new oceans as melting ice opens up the Arctic region. The Coast Guard is unique, as it is simultaneously a military force and a federal law enforcement agency. No other DoD service can claim that. We protect and defend more than 100,000 miles of U.S. coastline and navigable rivers and safeguard the largest exclusive economic zone in the world, a zone 200 nautical miles out to sea, 4.5 million square miles, stretching from north of the Arctic Circle to south of the equator, from Puerto Rico to Guam, encompassing 9 time zones. All with a force about the size of the New York City Police Department. The Coast Guard numbers just about 56,000, including our civilian force. We're a fraction of the size of any other DoD service, living on a budget of about $10 billion a year. That's just under the price of one naval aircraft carrier battle group. Not a bad value to the taxpayer. The 5th Armed Service, and only military branch in the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard has served in every war in U.S. history. Moreover, the Coast Guard is a first responder in humanitarian service. We render aid to people in trouble at sea or impacted by man and natural disasters. The Coast Guard also inspects all commercial vessels for safety. We investigate accidents on ships operating in our waters, as well as on any U.S. vessel operating anywhere in the world. We have a presence in Europe and the Far East, conducting international port security assessments. All of this to ensure the integrity of our maritime transportation system. Right here in Massachusetts, there are about 1,200 Coast Guard members manning shore units that regulate industry, mark channels with aids to navigation, working on patrol boats, search and rescue stations, and at an air station on Cape Cod. By law, the Coast Guard is responsible for 11 distinct maritime missions, but without running down that list, which I find people tend to forget, I'll quote a politician who captured the breadth of our responsibilities when he said, quote, "The Coast Guard is Congress's favorite manservant for every problem that's wet." While conducting law enforcement, rescue, and regulatory activities, one underlying focus prevails: the Coast Guard's duty to facilitate maritime commerce and protect the vital maritime transportation system. That system moves critical cargoes through our waters. Here in Boston, that means heating oil, cars, building materials, salt for the roads, intermodal containers filled with food, clothing, electronics, at just the tip of the iceberg. The Port of Boston contributes $4.6 billion, with a B, a year to the economy. 11.6 million metric tons of cargo arrive here by ship. More than 100 cruise ships called at the seaport last year. We're supposed to get 150 in the coming year. And 5,000 commuters crisscross Massachusetts Bay each day on ferries. 24/7, the Coast Guard's monitoring, regulating, and enforcing safety and security requirements aboard all foreign and domestic commercial ships, including fishing vessels that bring in seafood into our state, with a value second only to Alaska. So that's your context on the Coast Guard for tonight's discussion. We're here to focus exclusively on 2 of the Coast Guard's maritime missions. The first, and perhaps our most famous, search and rescue, has deep roots in the treacherous waters of New England. The second, marine environmental response and prevention and protection, is a high priority in New England's pristine and productive waters, both for marine life and recreation. I'm happy now to introduce my colleague, Commander Lee Titus, who is a chief of response operations at the sector, what we call the sector in Boston, and that means both search and rescue and marine environmental response. And he's also our search and rescue mission coordinator for the Coast Guard in Boston. Commander Titus.
Thank you, Captain, and good evening. Again, I'm Commander Lee Titus, Chief of Response to the U.S. Coast Guard here in Boston. As we said, working for Captain Gelzer, I'm responsible for coordinating all maritime law enforcement, security, environmental response, again, oil spill, and search and rescue operations from New Hampshire to Plymouth. While the Coast Guard has 11 official missions, search and rescue remains the primary. probably nowhere else in the Coast Guard is this SAR legacy more firmly rooted than right here in Massachusetts, with the first revenue cutter built in Newburyport, just north of here in 1791, and the birthplace of Joshua James, our most iconic lifesaver, just down the road in Hull. For me personally, search and rescue has always been near and dear and has consumed the majority of my professional career over the past 16 years. In that time, I've had the opportunity, or I suppose the misfortune, to experience search and rescue from the execution side while I'm at command of cutters at sea, and also from the planning side in rescue coordination centers in Seattle, in Boston, and now I'm the SAR mission coordinator here in Massachusetts. Now, before I begin to discuss our SAR work as we try to save us from the ocean, I'll say up front that the case that I plan to present was only the search and regrettably never ended in a rescue. But I hope it'll illustrate the complexity of how we respond to distress in the deep ocean. Even over my short career, advances in technology have made boating many times safer for the general public. Electronics that were only in reach of the military or commercial vessels 15 years ago, such as advanced navigation systems, radar, real-time weather reporting, satellite communications, and survival equipment are now commonplace on most ocean-going recreational boats. For example, emergency position indicating radio beacons, or EPIRBs, as most people know of them, now are $300 to $500 and fit in the back pocket at times. Advanced boat building materials and techniques have also greatly enhanced the durability and seaworthiness of the vessels. But every year around the world, hundreds of vessels are lost at sea, often taking thousands of crew members to the bottom. For some perspective, just within the nation in 2015, the Coast Guard responded to over 16,000 search and rescue cases, saving 3,536 lives. Here within our area of responsibility, we responded to 373 cases with 88 lives saved. I don't offer these stats to tout our work, but rather to show that we will never be ahead of the SAR mission. And it's hard to understand or even try to explain what drives SAR cases. But from my experience, most cases almost always are a result of dynamic marine conditions or equipment malfunctions or failures that are then compounded by sea and heavy weather. Also, and probably the most prevalent reasons for distress, are that many boaters simply underestimate the power of the sea or overestimate their or their vessel's capabilities. But I'll say, if you must get into trouble at sea, I ask you to please do so within the coastal region, within Captain's region here, out about 20 to 30 nautical miles. And there are plenty of people getting into distress within the zone each year. However, within this coastal area, I can dispatch multiple ships in boats, helicopters, planes to arrive with under an hour to the distress. Additionally, our VHF radio communications are highly effective in the region, often providing near instantaneous location of the distress. But I ask you, what if the distress call comes from here, 1,100 nautical miles at sea? This falls within our larger district boundary, running from the Canadian border to northern New Jersey and out to sea, 1,300 nautical miles. Following is a case that I coordinated with my district command center team back in 2013, which highlights the complexity of offshore searches and will allow me to show some of the tools we rely on for planning and execution. On May 4th, 2013, the 40-foot sailing vessel Cheeky Rafiki departed Antigua en route to the Azores with a crew of 4 men aged 25 to 50. 2 of the crew were highly experienced in ocean crossings. And I say this is a typical route there on the right, and notably not a straight line to the Azores, but rather well north to just below the ice fields, but where they're able to pick up westerly consistent winds. Similar routes have been used since Columbus began sailing here and back. Now, for the first 10 days, the trip was relatively uneventful until they began to enter a late season storm system on the 14th. You can see the relatively rapid track north of the Cheeky Rafiki, then the slower advances as they shift to the east, the red dots there, on the 14th and 15th and began to encounter a massive weather system with increasing winds and seas. And even if you are not familiar with offshore weather maps, one can innately understand that this is a bad situation for the vessel. Late Thursday evening, 15 May, Boston Rescue Coordination Center received an initial report from the Coordination Center in England that they had a report of a sailing vessel taking on some water, but they were keeping up with it and were not requesting assistance. 4 hours later, early morning on Friday, England passed an email from the sailing vessel stating that the flooding was worse and they were unsure of the source. We immediately tried their satellite phone with no response and then launched a C-130 long-range rescue aircraft from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which had about a 5-hour estimated time of arrival to 1,100 nautical miles at sea. Minutes later, our command center received the first personal locator beacon, or a PLB, transmitted via satellite. That's like the EPIRB, but a manual one. Within the command center, we received the visual icon and position of the PLB that had been activated, much like what you would think. It comes up on the screen with an alarming, horrible alarm as well. Unlike an emergency position indicating beacon that is installed on vessel, which automatically deploys, a PLB must be manually activated. That's key. A second PLB began transmitting several hours after the first. Notably, the sailing vessel's larger EPIRB was never deployed. Distance and time to the scene of our fixed-wing air asset was about 4 to 6 hours through the whole search, leaving only about 3 to 4 hours of search time. Also, unlike our helicopter assets, fixed-wing aircraft have limited direct rescue capabilities. They can drop a life raft, radios, then must wait for a surface vessel to arrive. In the deep ocean, we often rely on a system of cargo vessels that are willing to divert and assist mariners in distress. Most vessels are often 10 to 15 or more hours from the scene and often must wait for conditions to improve to effect rescue. Mid-morning on Friday, the C-130 arrived on scene and reported 15 to 20-foot seas, 50-knot winds, or 60 miles per hour, which is just below the hurricane force. Water temps were reading 55 and air temp was 50. I say at sea, the Cheeky Rafiki would have been completely lost from view in the trough of the waves, except for the mast. For someone in the water, the wind and sea noise would have been deafening. The tops of the waves would be torn in sheets by the wind, and the person would struggle to keep from drowning from the force of the sea spray alone. Now, I know when I first started my career running cases at sea on the patrol boats, I had a misguided idea that just about anything incongruent from the vast blue sea would immediately be seen and pop out to searchers. I soon realized how wrong I was. Now, when I flip to the next slide, I would like the first person to see that sees and identifies the object the Coast Guard and Navy boats are searching for to raise their hand. You have an advantage in the front. Any guesses?
Right.
Well, let's see what we have here. The Coast Guard actually knew the vessel was there, and we're just preparing to board. I like to think that the Navy may still have been looking. Granted, these men were trying to evade and hide, but this was a 35-foot go-fast with 4 men, fuel barrels, 1,000 kilograms of cocaine. And I ask you, how difficult do you think it would be to spot a person in the water in 20-foot waves in 50-knot winds? How about if just the head of the survivor were above the water? So again, our first search assets arrived on scene. Nothing was located. Multiple locator beacon hits in the area, but no signs of survivors. And we began to saturate the area with both air and surface assets. The yellow icons represent separate signals and position reports received from the first and then the second PLB, the locator beacon, over the first day of searching. The series of black triangles are the fixed search patterns the aircraft used to quickly scan the area upon arrival. As noted, we had lost already 5 hours just getting to the scene. But in those harsh conditions, we were working fast against a survivability clock for someone in the water or even in a life raft. Getting an accurate estimate of survivability is absolutely essential in our planning and eventually when we may need to be forced to call off a search. Since the end of World War II, Coast Guard has continually refined and adapted cold water models, and currently we use a probability of survival decision, or PSDA, model, which is a cold water immersion survival calculator which predicts heat loss and dehydration. Two key core temperature points are calculated. First is functional at 93 degrees Fahrenheit, then survival at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. The functional point is critical, as it basically means that someone could self-rescue and, most importantly, actively keep their face out of the water. The PSD model is based on extensive Canadian and US military cold water immersion experiments, and yes, the military has immersed thousands of volunteers, as well as from survival debrief data starting with sailors and pilots from World War I. It's important to note that this model is based primarily on empirical data, while cold water survival depends on hundreds of environmental and physiological variables. For example, scientists simply cannot quantify a will to survive. That said, in the end, the body can only retain heat so long, and the physics of cold water immersion will eventually take over. To give you an idea of the relentless physics of cold water immersion, I want to show you an example of how this works even close to shore. And John, it's good to know that you're a kayaker as well. So, I've asked the model to simulate an average middle-aged male in relatively benign late winter weather. 46-degree air temperature may seem brisk right now, but after a long, hard New England winter, this is almost balmy, and we see kayakers hit the water in these late winter, early spring conditions. So this gentleman rolled over 1 mile from shore with no life jacket. In under 2 hours, the man would no longer be able to actively keep his head out of the water. And in 7 hours, he would be dead. The physics are unrelenting and brutal. For the crew of the 4 on the sailing vessel, we conservatively calculated that they would have all made it into the life raft, and they would reach the functional point at 16 hours, in survival at 20. Remember, it took us 6 hours for the first asset to arrive. For our calculations, we used the air temp, as I mentioned, 50, and water temp of 55, wind speed of 50, and an average victim, much like our kayaker. Immersed in water to the waist. Now, this immersion is designed to simulate being in a raft in heavy weather conditions where it's impossible to keep the raft clear of water, and they would be immersed to the waist during the rough water. According to our calculations, the crew reached functional time on Saturday around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then survival around 8 p.m. And this is really where the arts and science of search and rescue planning begins. The art of search planning relates to the assumptions. We are often forced to make hundreds, if not thousands, of assumptions over a case because we simply never have all of the facts of the boat, the scenario, or the crew. In this case, no vessel was sighted. They must be in the water or in the raft. Did they stay with the vessel? Were they separated? Did they even make it out alive? We simply did not know. Not to diminish the important work, you mentioned the land searches of our counterparts running land searches, because they are not easy. But on land, there are certain constants, meaning there's an average distance that can be walked, generally in an hour, or victims generally head downhill, they then follow water, etc. At sea, environmental weather factors can change by the minute. Currents can run with or opposed to prevailing winds. Most importantly, every boat or object in the water drifts uniquely based on shape and its gear configuration. Finally, each of these uniquely drifting objects are subject to divergence, which means, depending on the angle of the object to the seas and winds, it can drift along 2 vectors, which can offset up to 90 degrees. For years, search planners relied on static drift data from a few objects and observed weather to calculate the possible drift. And we certainly located many people in those years. I began my career drawing the drift vectors on paper charts. But now thinking back, there was a lot more art of SAR, I think, involved in those searches. As of the late 90s, Coast Guard began developing and using complex computer modeling programs that calculate drift based on historical, current, and predicted weather with predetermined detailed drift characteristics on multiple objects. Currently, U.S. Coast Guard uses the latest generation modeling called Search and Rescue Optimal Planning System, or SAR-OPS. This system pulls highly accurate wind and current conditions from Navy and NOAA weather databases, then uses the data to theoretically drift 5,000 objects in the water to establish the most probable areas to search. Now, just please excuse the simplicity of the following analogy, but it's how the program was originally described to me. Imagine releasing 5,000 rubber ducks, all set with the mathematical characteristics of a 40-foot sailing vessel, life raft, or someone in the water, and see how they move over time. Now, this dull shot, and it is horribly dull, shows a point off of Cape Ann near Gloucester in which I had the system drop 2,500 particles with the drift characteristics of a life raft and 25 designed to drift like a person in the water. So this same 5,000 particles drifted over 12 hours, 20-knot winds and moderate seas. You'll see that the pink number ones are the life raft particles, and the brown number twos are drifting like a person in the water. This looked fairly compact, I know, but in 12 hours, the search area has stretched to almost 20 miles by 10 miles wide, 200 square nautical miles. Time is not just against us in surviving cold water, but also area to cover. As we return back to the case, during the first 3 critical days, remember the survival clock, we called in a C-130 aircraft from Canada, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, all the way from Air Force in Georgia, refueling on the way. More than 10 commercial and private vessels crisscrossed the area. The weather improved and we saturated the area, searching more than 4,200 square nautical miles of ocean. The colored blocks are representing the drifted particles instead of the ones and twos, with the black lines depicting the various surface and air search patterns for those first 3 days that we saturated. On Sunday, a vessel spotted the overturned hull in the search area. We continued to search initially until early Monday morning, then initially called off the search almost 30 hours beyond survival, or as we say, suspended active searching or access. Then, with considerable cross-Atlantic governmental pressure, we reopened the search on Tuesday, then continued to search for another 4 days, calling on air assets from England, the Azores, US, and Canada, as well as multiple Coast Guard and Navy ships and helicopters, to finally search more than 25,000 square miles spread over 225 miles. As we were completing our final searches on Friday, 7 days into the search, before recommending calling off the search a second time, a Navy ship and helicopter relocated the hull in the drifted area. We were in luck that there's a giant circular current in the middle of the Atlantic. The life raft, we sent a diver down. The life raft was confirmed to be still stowed on the boat. All 4 sailors were presumed lost at sea. We will simply never know for sure what happened in the last several hours before we lost contact with the vessel. But the keel had been torn from the hull. And this is my opinion. I believe the flooding was coming from damaged bolts holding the keel on. Once the keel broke free, the vessel would have violently rolled multiple times within minutes. Some of the crew may have been thrown overboard. We mentioned the PLBs being activated, while some of them may never have made it out of the cabin. The accident was dynamic, rapid, with almost no time to react or prepare. The case was tragic, and like all the unresolved cases in my career, still haunts me to this day. But during the week before and then 2 weeks after this accident, several strong, unexpected low-pressure systems ripped through the same transit zone, and we successfully located and rescued crews from 3 other sailboats in the same region. I don't understand what caused a series of late-season weather systems to push through that year, but as the sea temperatures rise and currents shift, the weather patterns and sea routes that sailors have relied on for hundreds of years will also change. And already we see as sea ice recedes further north, Some cross-Atlantic vessels are pushing north into colder waters with more consistent wind, but of course farther and farther from rescue assets. I do know, however, that as mariners adapt, we too will continue to work to save them from our oceans. Thank you.
All right, well, it's easy for me. He is one of the best part of my team there in Boston, and I thought that was really well done. I know I shouldn't say that, but I only will say that for anyone here who is venturing out into the water, you should know that this is the guy that is managing that search, and he is the guy who takes the calls at 3 in the morning and really doesn't rest until we have found somebody and hopefully brought him home safely. So, and he made it very clear. We're going to shift gears now. The ocean is a dangerous place for people. And that case is a really good example of that. But I believe that it is equally vulnerable to man, from man. And for thousands of years, people have used the ocean as a medium for transportation and the movement of critical commodities. Billions and billions of gallons of oil are transported by sea via tank ship. And while sea transportation remains by far the safest mode over truck, pipeline, and rail, when spills occur in the ocean, the consequences are very high. So today I'll talk about the system we've developed to protect the ocean from people, and specifically the challenging scenario when oil spills at sea. So I like to start with this photo when I'm explaining the purpose and the goal of the Coast Guard's Marine Environmental Protection Mission and our National Contingency Plan for spills. He's a little alarming, isn't he? It's a very young pelican, 4 weeks old to be exact, and I used this very photo to try and inspire my team during the Coast Guard's response to the largest marine oil spill in history, Deepwater Horizon. I had never seen a baby brown pelican before I was deployed to Venice, Louisiana for that entire summer, beginning in the spring of 2010. I had actually never been really to the Gulf. And that spill, of course, was a result of the catastrophic explosion and loss of the drill rig named Deepwater Horizon. And we should never talk about this epic oil spill without mentioning first the tragic loss of 11 drill workers who were killed that day. Most Coast Guard cases include several of our maritime missions that bleed into one another during a large-scale response. That event began with a desperate Mayday call and an immense search and rescue response that I won't talk about today, but it ultimately morphed into a massive oil spill response and accident investigation. And all simultaneously, these were responsibilities and priorities for the Coast Guard. It was estimated that more than 200 million gallons of oil spilled before BP was able to cap the well after 87 days. It was an operation unlike any we had ever seen. Back to our baby pelican on his nest in the mangroves of Breton Island off the coast of Louisiana. I remember tacking this photo up in the command post, and it prompted my operations section chief to walk over and say, "That's one ugly bird, ma'am." It looks like a pterodactyl ghost from Scooby-Doo. But if that's what we're here to protect, then I'm on it. You see, coasties are lifesavers by nature, even when we're talking about pelican lives. Our mission that summer was sobering: to protect Plaquemines Parish, the closest point of land to the oil spill 40 miles away. It's home to the Delta National Wildlife Refuge. Plaquemines is comprised of 48,000 acres of highly sensitive marsh, home to countless species of fish, waterfowl, marine reptiles, and mammals, and nursery for their offspring. I was incident commander for that area with a team of 2,800 responders, including 150 Coast Guard members. The stakes were very high. One of our many marine environmentally sensitive areas amidst that entire sensitive marshland was Breton Island, home to this pelican chick who was born after the spill as the oil was spreading out across the water and threatening the island. It was our job to protect him and thousands of pelicans and other bird species that made that precious habitat their home. So I'm going to come back to him a little bit later. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was unique in many respects, including the source of the spill from an offshore rig. We were used to ships being the source of spill. The challenge in securing that source, it's always our first priority: secure the source. we could not secure the source, and an unimaginable volume of oil from a well with a seemingly unlimited capacity. The timing of the spill was particularly problematic in regard to wildlife impacts during the vibrant spring season in the Gulf. It was hard from every perspective, scientifically, politically, and psychologically, to the people of the Gulf who had suffered greatly from Hurricane Katrina. However, this catastrophe showed that the nation's system of preparing for and responding to oil spills is ultimately sound, even under the most extreme circumstances, and it's designed to optimize the devastating impacts of any spill. That's not to say there weren't lasting impacts of this spill, or any oil spill for that matter. Once oil spills into the water, we are in a losing proposition. So I won't sugarcoat it. Just one example. Audubon estimates that 1 million coastal birds died as a result of the Deepwater Horizon spill. There were many, many other catastrophic effects. That's just one. Prevention is the only true answer to an oil spill, and this is one in which the Coast Guard is highly invested in intensive regulation of the shipping industry and its safety. But as long as oil is our primary energy source and human factors exist, accidents will happen, and even if less frequently, oil will spill. Without the system in place to respond to spills that has existed for the past 25 years, I submit that the outcome would have been a lot worse. Deepwater Horizon drew a grand total of 47,000 federal, state, and local responders, including 68 Coast Guard personnel and dozens of Coast Guard aircraft and cutters, and many other agency aircraft and National Guardsmen. Across the 5 Gulf states that were impacted, responders recovered 35 million gallons of oil, millions of pounds of oil debris from 900 miles of beach, and deployed 2,000 miles of containment boom to protect sensitive habitat. The spill redefined every measure of our nation's response capability, and yet its impact on our national system was not as profound as a much smaller spill, still groundbreaking, that had occurred 20 years before. And many of you know this, the Exxon Valdez in 1989, at the very beginning of my Coast Guard career. Although 20 times smaller than Deepwater, it ensured the creation of a system that was absolutely critical to managing the massive Gulf Coast disaster. To fully grasp the Coast Guard's efforts to protect the ocean from oil spills and man, you have to understand the significance of the Exxon Valdez event. After running aground on Bligh Reef and spilling 11 million gallons of heavy crude into Alaska's pristine Prince William Sound in 1989, a slow and challenged response was the catalyst for creating stricter and a systematic approach to environmental disasters. For the nation and the Coast Guard, it served as a basis for the emergence of a stronger regime to drastically improve the shipment of oil and the way oil spills are handled both on the water and in the courtroom. 18 months after the event, in August of 1990, Congress amended the Clean Water Act by passing the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. This changed the way we did business, creating a comprehensive prevention, response, liability, and compensation regime to deal with spills from ships and facilities into the navigable U.S. waters. The Oil Pollution Act brought significant advances, such as setting new requirements for vessel construction, crew licensing, and manning. Most notably, it mandated double hulls for oil tank ships, a second wall with a buffer encapsulating the cargo to prevent damage from collision or grounding. The last single hull ship, they were phased out of operation just last year, 25 years after the Milestone spill. The law significantly broadened financial responsibility requirements. It specified that the spiller would pay. It seems obvious, right? Now, companies would be required to pay for cleanup and compensation, all liable for costs and damages. It imposed stiffer civil and criminal penalties and even jail time for certain spills. The regulations tightened the authority of the federal on-scene coordinator to oversee spill response and preparedness activities at the local level. The Coast Guard is the federal on-scene coordinator in the coastal zone, the EPA in the inland zone. This approach in and of itself was well ahead of its time and remains a model for integrating all involved parties into the response organization. As federal on-scene coordinator, the Coast Guard acts as that honest broker, bringing together all the stakeholders with different skill sets to solve this unsolvable problem. And this happens before the spill, which is critical during the preparedness piece. This ensures a viable plan for oil spill response. That includes frequent exercises to enhance readiness for a spill. In each port, the Coast Guard chairs something called the Area Committee. The co-chair comes from the state, in this case, the Mass Environmental Department. Committee members include federal, state, and local environmental agencies, and importantly, the maritime industry, is on the hot seat, particularly oil companies and transporters. It also includes non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, scientists from academia and from industry, as well as tribal reps. They all come to the table to plan ahead for a spill. If a spill actually occurs, these players come together, but now with some familiarity and a plan. The Coast Guard, the state, and the responsible party form a unified command in the event of a spill, where the Coast Guard holds 51% of the vote on response decisions. But it takes full advantage of the spiller's typically vast resources to resolve the issue. They write the checks. Again, oil spills are messy events, but there is a way to optimize the outcome and best mitigate environmental damage. If we get to that point, we are positioned to do that, having prepared in advance and educated the industry on the expectation for an aggressive response. As a rule, most members of the Coast Guard do not have extensive training in the science of oil spills. What we do have is military training, training to lead in crisis, training to bring order to chaos. As a federal on-scene coordinator, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room, and that's lucky for all of you. What I do need to do is know how to find the smartest person and bring them to the table. And we have a good track record of bringing similar and disparate groups together and drawing out the most positive solutions. It's not about command and control. You do need command and control when you're doing law enforcement or when you're conducting military operations, but it doesn't work for environmental response. There we work to build trust and consensus, to break down stovepipes and parochialisms, to maintain the big picture. The Coast Guard has a similar role facilitating research and development efforts across the interagency for oil spill response. Again, not being the scientist. We have a voice as well in the international regime, bringing together and cultivating mature relationships via long agreements that we've had to coordinate planning, training, exercises, and spill response with our neighbors to the north in Canada and in Mexico, and now a big focus with Russia in the Arctic because of all the oil moving through the very sensitive Arctic, and in the Caribbean and with the Panama Canal Authority. All of these efforts are integral to a marine environmental protection program and process that combines proactive planning, disciplined exercising, and collaborative response, as well as rigorous study and resolution of lessons learned. We try to take every spill and learn from where we made mistakes. And the greatest challenge is to balance all of that and the work to protect the environment with balance of the facilitation of commerce, which is absolutely something we have to do in this country. The marine transportation system is the lifeblood of our national economy. More than 2 billion gallons of oil and liquefied natural gas come by ship into the Port of Boston every year. Those tank ships transit across Stellwagen Bank, an 800-plus square mile marine sanctuary and feeding grounds for whales just 25 miles east of Boston. All the jet fuel for Logan Airport comes right into Boston through its very rigid navigable channels and delivered to Sunoco on the very narrow Chelsea Creek. Oil spills remain a daily threat, but our prevention and preparedness efforts have reduced the risk considerably. We continue to work together, the public and private sectors and academia. Partnerships are paramount. Through these efforts, we've seen a marked decrease in the annual number of spills. We have less than a third of the number of spills we experienced in the mid-90s, and spill quantities have dropped considerably, with the exception of the few really big ones. From the early 90s to present, an average of 3 gallons of oil were spilled for every 1 million gallons of oil transported. Fewer spills mean fewer opportunities to train and refine our response practices during actual spills. So that's a downside, but those are good trade-offs in my opinion. So that makes exercising even more important than ever to keep sharp and ready. This past summer, we held one of our area committee meetings and a tabletop exercise to test our response to a spill in Stellwagen Bank during the whale season. It's unthinkable. It raised innumerable concerns and conversations about trade-offs that we continue to tackle. We must continuously question our techniques to push for continued improvements in R&D for spill response technologies and to unfailingly invest in partnerships. Our goal is to ensure we retain the expertise to prevent, prepare for, and respond when necessary so we can recover from future incidents in an increasingly complex national and global operating environment. So let's return to the Pelican Chicks on Breton Island. In our command post, around the table, I had every federal agency that might have a stake in the spill: EPA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Guard. I had the parish representatives. I had the state of Louisiana. Everyone's around the table. Everyone's raising their issues. The representative from U.S. Fish and Wildlife was responsible for the island and the National Wildlife Refuge. As incident commander, he asked me to prioritize the island and its protection, as it was anticipated that oil would be washing ashore in the coming days during this absolutely critical point. And there were frankly too many priorities to balance, but his voice at the table and what was at stake compelled us to redouble our efforts. With 3 layers of containment boom and near 24-hour monitoring due to the dynamic environment there, we did just that. And while there were reports of pelicans on the island that had been oiled, it was actually limited to those that had flown offshore to feed and had returned contaminated. Because of our collective efforts, oil did not reach the shores of Breton Island or the pelican nests in a detrimental way. In the bottom photo, you can see just how many birds inhabit this island. I mean, that's just one stretch of it. There are pelicans, sandwich terns, gulls. If birds freak you out, this is not where you want to be. But it was absolutely fascinating. And in the background, you can barely see this black stretch is our oil containment boom. One layer of it from, it was a very large Navy boom that was part of our tiered protection system. So that summer, the Fish and Wildlife Service had planned to cancel the annual banding of juvenile pelicans, fearing the added stress on top of the spill would be catastrophic to the colony. But because the island remained protected in the end, they were able to reschedule the banding, which would prove critical and provide data in the coming years that they absolutely needed. I got the unique chance to step out of the command post and assist in banding, and it was a prime opportunity to reflect on the reason we were there. My partner from Fish and Wildlife invited me to come along, and it changed my perspective inordinately. There were many failures during the spill, volumes of lessons learned from our response efforts, but we did enjoy some small successes. Despite the heavy wildlife losses, since that time, Fish and Wildlife reports some good news regarding breeding birds on Breton Island. The number of colonial nesting seabirds nesting on the island has generally increased. In the year following the spill, over 8,500 brown pelican nests and over 120,000 tern nests were documented on the refuge, which represents the largest number of pelican nests recorded since Hurricane Katrina and the largest number of tern nests in over a decade. This is just a small example of how much we have at stake in protecting our oceans from people. The Coast Guard will remain committed and focused on this important mission and priority for our nation. Thank you for being here today. It represents the commitment that you show for protecting our oceans, and we would love to answer any questions that you have now.
So thank you, Claudia, and Captain Gelzer and Commander Titus. We have a microphone here. We're actually recording this live. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll pass around the microphone as such. Actually, I have, okay, here's one here. Let me ask one question first, since I get the prerogative of doing that. So I understand the SAR models for drift, but I was kind of curious, for the oil spill, predicting where the oil might go and spread, are there any models for this?
And we're fortunate, the Coast Guard has a relationship with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and every Coast Guard area, every district, like Lee explained, from Maine to New York, has a NOAA scientific support coordinator that is assigned to us, because we're not scientists, as our science advisor. And NOAA has highly sophisticated models that they run on spill trajectories, and we've had great success trying to anticipate where things are going to go.
Okay, so I as a follow-up question, this is partly because of the course I teach. We look at, I teach them about, my students, about ocean currents, and so there are a lot of simulations and actually tracking data. So I see the Atlantic currents, there's like a loop that goes through the Gulf Stream and then, or goes through the Gulf and then out around Florida. Yeah. Was there a thought or a concern that there was a possibility that the Deepwater Horizon oil might have gotten caught in one of those vortices?
That was a huge concern, and we had sort of at the national level, we had all the agencies sit around the table in the National Response Team, which is made up of all the federal agencies with a stake, and NOAA's a big voice on that, and that concern of catching in the loop current, they anticipated that it could go up as far as North Carolina and beyond. Yeah. Okay. And so they kept watching that, and they had a kind of a plan for how to mitigate. Okay. But it didn't end up doing that.
Yeah, good. So we had a question over here.
Great, thank you. A compliment and a question, or thanks and a question. My wife and I actually traveled down to the Gulf during the spill as part of a task force from the New England Aquarium observing what was going on. And we were on Grand Island. I just have to say that, what we observed in terms of the efforts on the part of the people there in the cleanup, coordinated by you, were really tremendous. It was like a war zone, and an amazing amount of work was getting done. So thank you for your efforts on that.
Do you think you could write a letter to Anderson Cooper?
I'm happy to write a letter, whoever you think ought to get one. Secondly, I'm worried about the Arctic, and I wonder what sort of international because it's a complicated sovereignty issue. What kind of rapid response assets are in place for a spill? And I understand the Coast Guard is somewhat shy on icebreakers. Could you comment?
Sure, and we have one icebreaker, and we are hoping to have more in the coming decade. But there's been a tremendous focus on planning for Arctic spill response, and as you know, there have been efforts and hopes and plans to drill in the Arctic. And having worked at our national level program, I'm here to tell you that responding to a spill in the Arctic is like responding on the moon. And it is really the tyranny of the distance and the weather, the dynamic weather and the cold water temperatures. And that is not to say that we are not continually looking and working on research and development and working with our partner agencies and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which looks at whether or not to issue the permits to drill. We've done a number of exercises bringing together the Alaskan government, and we are working with the other Arctic nations on these really tough questions. And there are plans in place, and we really look to the industry to provide the response capability, and if they want to be able to do it and they get the permission to do it, then the onus is on them. But so much of the infrastructure doesn't even exist to bring the materials in or to bring the people and the responders in. So tons of tough questions on that, and it's really something to keep a close eye on and to watch and monitor and I think that's. It's one of those very, very, very tough things, because responding to an oil spill under the best of conditions is really hard. So we continue to grapple with that, and we work very hard on the prevention piece and making sure that we're doing these inspections and making sure ships are safe, and so that's really what we're very, very much focused on, and continue to work on the other piece. But there's a lot of study and good work going on. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for those very nice presentations. My question is how much unmanned drones, may be changing your operations? Are they, likely to be game changers in the way that you do things, or are they, just not going to be very useful in the kinds of weather that you often have to deal with?
Well, I think they actually would be very useful, just to be able to have consistent presence watching, both from environmental response as well as search and rescue. It's really the issue of time that we can stay on scene, maintaining communications, maintaining visibility. But to be completely honest, at this point, we are not allowed to use unmanned aircraft. It's a regulatory issue at this point for the government. So I hope that.
Yeah,
Captain, you have an idea.
And that's something I think the Coast Guard's working on to try to get through that, because this is technology that we should be fully taking advantage of. And from the oil spill response part, on the icebreaker that we have, that we put scientists on going up in the Arctic, they are experimenting with the use of drones and for our spill response, which would be phenomenal considering the risks of putting aircraft up in that environment. So there's certainly some testing going on, and I know the industry is also putting a lot of emphasis on those capabilities.
Actually, sort of related to that, I'm really curious about sort of some of your favorite interesting research projects, whether that's with groups around here or in Woods Hole. Do you have any sort of favorite ones that you want to highlight?
In regard to search and rescue or
I was sort of anything. I don't know. I sort of no idea what the Coast Guard does research into, and sort of I'm more along the lines of sort of I guess like very low level basic research. Do you know what I mean?
So one that I would say I think is we have a number of partnerships with partner agencies who also have a stake in spill response, EPA and BSEE, and BSEE manages a burn pan down in Alabama that we're working to test, how to more effectively burn oil, which has trade-offs as well, air trade-offs, but that's one big project. We have our R&D center is in Groton, Connecticut, and I'm 2 years out of the job where I was really focused on that, but it might be that I need to get back to you on sort of what the latest and greatest is in terms of what they're looking at. But burning oil and obviously looking really closely at the impacts of using dispersants.
There's one back here, and then one up here.
This is about rescue. I'm just curious. You've pointed out rescue operations where people who seem to know what they're doing get in trouble. And on land with hiking and mountaineering and stuff like that, there's just a lot of very careless stuff that the people don't prepare properly. They run out in sneakers and stuff, and then the next thing you know, they're in trouble, but they also risk the lives of the rescuers. Do you give us an idea of like proportion? Do you get a lot of that stuff on sea? Do you see what I mean? It's a little cynical.
I mean, I've got my thoughts, but you.
I'll be honest with you, it's just so dynamic. The weather conditions, and if we just take our region here, even on a beautiful summer day, it can be gorgeous all day long. And then we get a fast cell come through, and we have 5-6 boats going aground, or we have somebody taking on water. The weather's been perfect all day long. So I'm not gonna call that person was due to their inexperience. I think people just get caught unaware. I think that the conditions overwhelm people so quickly. Captain, go ahead.
Well, and so that, I think that's very much true. And we've had marine events where we have big kayak or stand-up paddle races, and without any warning, the storm system will change, and suddenly we've got 40 people in the water. And so, that can happen. What I think we experience that I think most people don't realize is this is obviously a beautiful area with wonderful summers and lots of recreational kayakers and stand-up paddlers, and really what we end up doing is we end up looking for everyone that is ends up being a mystery. If your kayak blows off of your dock and you don't know it, so you're just out at the mall, the Coast Guard is going to look for you for days, potentially. And so we're always pushing for, just realize we always assume the worst. And we have our calculation, and we will run our drift models, and it doesn't matter what day, time, or how long, and we're going to look until we get an answer. And it's hard on the kayaks because with boats, small boats that get, that have hull numbers, we can figure out who the owner is. But if you don't put your name and number on your kayak, then there's a lot of assets and resources and aircraft and people risking their lives to look for somebody who's not even in trouble. So that's the only other thing I'd say about that. But we do have people who I think really greatly underestimate the power of this area and how treacherous the waters are. And they're just not necessarily loaded for bear when they go out there.
That's right.
Yeah, I'll attest. May I give a personal? So in 2003, I was paddling in Nantucket Sound, sunny skies. It was October, so the water temperature was about 53 degrees. I did notice it. I put on a wetsuit to go out. Was paddling. I don't know. About half an hour later, huge fog bank comes in and basically just blank out. Can't see a darn thing. I noticed the wind direction, so I used that as kind of a natural compass and found my way back to shore. But the next day, I went out paddling, and harbor master stopped me and asked if I'd seen 2 young women in kayaks. And they had launched exactly the same time I'd launched in sunny weather. They were wearing bathing suits and T-shirts in recreational kayaks. They told their boyfriends they were going to be back in 10 minutes. After 45, 50 minutes, they didn't return. This is when the fog was really thick. And then a massive search and rescue was triggered. Everybody with a boat was out there on the water, and that day I saw a Coast Guard helicopter just going up and down, presumably using the drift models to figure out where to search. And they found the 2 kayaks tied together. no women, and then the next day they found the body of one of the young women, never found the body of the other. That was a case where, you know, if the fog hadn't rolled in suddenly, they probably would have been just fine, but not being dressed for immersion was clearly a contributory factor, and the swift change in conditions. And so it was basically sort of two things that compounded themselves. So that's, you know, my own personal experience. And then I went to town, you know, with safety equipment and everything at that point, because I, you know, escaped with my life, but, you know, I wasn't gonna risk it again. So that's my own personal anecdote. We have a question up here.
You talked about the, fortunately, relatively few incidents you have to train against. To what extent are you using simulation technologies? I mean, I certainly know that air crews do, but in a larger, more macro.
For oil
sense.
spills.
Yeah.
You know, we're limited on what we can actually put in the water, if you mean like physically. We do some simulation, but there, you know, we're actually, you know, at the national level, they're really trying to get permission in certain areas to actually spill oil so that we can practice responding to it in the safest possible environment. They do this in other countries, and we really need to do it in order to be able to, and we have, you know, in New Jersey, there's a really cool oil spill facility that's a big pool that's run by BSEE, and we do a lot of work with them to try to figure out which technologies and skimmers work the best. And but for small spills, even locally, we might simulate just so that, you know, when we're testing industry, because that's what we do. We go out to industry and we say, guess what? You have an unscheduled drill. You just spilled 2,100 gallons, Exxon, go. And so sometimes we'll pour peat moss or something in there so they can actually be chasing something in reality. But, you know, we're somewhat limited on how we simulate spills.
What about digital technologies?
Well, and I'd say that our NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator can help us with that, because they always do provide these trajectories about where the oil might go. And so that, we definitely take full advantage of the digital and the scientific way of doing it.
Question right there. Yeah, you can just pass it over. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about just other contaminants in the water. So my specific idea was maybe fracking contaminants, and you know that hasn't really hit the oceans as far as I know, and it's relatively new. What are you guys? Are you planning for that, or is that not really on your radar at all?
Right, so all of that kind of change in how we're extracting oil, it isn't really impacting Massachusetts so much, but a lot of those oils are being carried by rail. So even in New York, you know, on the Hudson, there's threats and there's lots of focus, and we have really changed our response plans to try to ensure that we know, because those materials, they react a little bit differently in the water and they're a little higher volatility, and so that has absolutely been looked at nationwide and continues. We have a continued challenge there because we had a lot of rail accidents there for a while, and a lot of times they go over the water, and so that's definitely something we look at. And in fact, you know, it just happens that right now those commodities are not coming through our area, but some chemicals are going by rail, and so we also look in those areas where they come over waterways, and we have chemical response techniques and procedures that we're constantly working on. But the fracking oil is something that we're absolutely focused on the last 3 years.
So you have time for two last questions. 2 hands up, so let's go with those.
This is for Captain Gelzer. So obviously you mentioned that prevention is the best strategy of all. And you mentioned that we were successful in going from single-hulled to double-hulled vessels. But since Deepwater Horizon, I understand that before Deepwater Horizon, there was a requirement in many other countries to provide a relief well. Have we implemented mandatory relief wells in the United States?
So that again is the BSEE, the agency that was Minerals Management Service, that was split back off, so there wouldn't be a conflict between the agency that sold the leases and the agency that enforced the response. That is an issue. That is their responsibility and their issue, and I think they are in fact working on that. And in this case, I think, as you know, they believed that was the case, but it wasn't in fact. But all of those issues are being worked. I mean, the Coast Guard, that is, you know, that we don't have that oversight. We do inspect the drill rig, but we don't inspect any of the, undersea and underwater, but BSEE is and it's the Bureau of Ocean and Enforcement Management, BOEM, is the other part of that split off that are looking at those issues. So, I mean, those are really important, critical issues. And they're working and doing more drill exercises and making sure that there's, that they test those capabilities.
Hi, I was just curious about how involved the Coast Guard is with global climate change, sea level rise. Is that what concern, how do you get involved with that? And then what is the voice that the Coast Guard has at the federal level about your concerns?
Sure. I mean, I don't know where, do you have an answer? Yeah, so.
Locally, we work in folks.
Right, and we're at the local level working on all sorts of emergency response plans, and we are working with the state and the local municipalities to make sure that we would, combine forces for response to ocean level risings, floodings. We're always in the game on that. We also have a seat at the ocean planning table, but it's more of the coastal zone management planners, and it falls a little bit out of our purview. We don't have the key voice in that conversation. We're responders and we're planners, and but we're definitely at the table and very involved in any emergency response type planning. But there's big issues that are facing any coastal area, and certainly Boston has huge challenges.
Okay, so let's thank Captain, the commander again.